And one of the stories that's not going away for the president is the Epstein files. Convicted sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell refused to answer any questions yesterday during a deposition for the House Oversight Committee. Maxwell, as you know, is a longtime companion of Jeffrey Epstein, serving a 20-year federal prison sentence for her role in aiding Epstein's sexual abuse of underage girls. But she repeatedly invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination yesterday.
Ms. Maxwell, did you at any time play any role in Jeffrey Epstein's activities involving the recruitment, grooming, or trafficking of young women or girls?
I invoke my Fifth Amendment right to silence.
Can you please provide us with all the names of other additional co-conspirators to the crimes perpetuated by you and Jeffrey Epstein?
I invoke my Fifth Amendment right to silence.
Maxwell is trying to get her conviction overturned. The Supreme Court rejected her appeal last year. In December, she requested that a federal judge in New York consider what her attorneys describe as substantial new evidence that her trial included constitutional violations. Maxwell's attorney told the Oversight Committee she would be willing to speak fully and honestly if granted clemency by President Trump. The Justice Department, meanwhile, invited members of Congress to view the Epstein files at DOJ headquarters, and many lawmakers are pointing out that many of those files still remain redacted. Congressman Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie, the co-sponsors of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, said some of the documents appeared to have been redacted by the FBI or grand juries before they arrived at the Justice Department.
What I saw that bothered me were the names of at least 6 men that have been redacted that are likely incriminated by their inclusion in these files.
There are 6 men, some of them with their photographs, that have been redacted, and there's no explanation why those people were redacted.
What we're after is the men who Jeffrey Epstein trafficked women to. We want those names published. We're not out to embarrass people. And the problem is we went in there hoping to see that in 302 forms. What we found out is those 302 forms were redacted before they got to the DOJ. At least one is a U.S. citizen, at least one is a foreigner, and the other 3 or 4 have names. I'm not sure if they're foreign or U.S.
And which field do they work in? Is it finance, banking, political?
One is pretty high up in the foreign government.
And some are, they're, one of the others is a pretty prominent individual.
Ro Khanna, Thomas Massie leading that bipartisan effort. Let's bring in MS Now's senior Capitol Hill reporter and host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale, and MS Now justice and intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian. So, Ken, I'll start with you. You heard Thomas Massie there, the congressman, hinting at some very high-profile names. And the frustration that we heard, not just from the 2 of them, but from many members who got a chance to go in and review these volumes of documents. The frustration about redactions that did not appear to be protecting victims.
Yeah, that's right, Willie. And I got to say, those of us who have been around government a long time and covered government, this redaction process at the Justice Department was an enormous undertaking involving hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. And there's no way that senior people at the DOJ reviewed every one of these documents. So you are going to find, and they are finding, errors, mistakes, over redactions, as they mentioned, stuff that was already redacted when it came in. And we've already seen that. And in some cases, the Justice Department has rolled back some of the redactions. Now, Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, is on social media pushing back against some of the observations of Massie and Khanna in some of these cases. But I have no doubt that there were some mistakes made, some redactions that shouldn't have been made, and they may or may not fix those things. You know, the whole point of grand jury secrecy is that if people are identified in criminal investigations, they may be implicated, there may be evidence of wrongdoing, but if they're not charged, those things are supposed to remain secret. Obviously, the society has decided there's a different standard in the Epstein case, and people want these names. They want any evidence that any of these men were involved in trafficking or aware of trafficking, and that's a reasonable thing, and they're going to get that. I have no doubt eventually that every single name that's relevant here will eventually be exposed.
Well, and there is a public interest, Ali, obviously, because so many of these men on that are being protected by Republicans right now, whether it's Republicans in the Department of Justice or Republicans on Comer's committee, a lot of these men either are in government here or across the world, or are prominent figures that maybe, I mean, we're seeing the head of the LA Olympics, seeing artists that he represented leaving for good reason, if you look at some of these things. But I guess the question is, why do they continue? When somebody, let's say Julie Brown, points something out, that they're protecting a guy that was talking about underage girls. Like, why are Republicans protecting these powerful elite? Why are these Republicans protecting the Epstein class that's running this country and the world?
And I think what Ken pointed out in regards to the way that things are done through the typical judicial process versus the court of public opinion, where a lot of this is being litigated, is pretty central to answering that question, right? Because what you're hearing from Thomas Massie after he goes in and sees these redactions and sees that some of the files are still redacted with names that don't make sense, he is now threatening to go to the House floor and do what the Epstein victims have long wanted to do but cannot, which is read out some of these names and put them into the public forum. It doesn't matter whether or not they can be prosecuted. Instead, it's light being the best disinfectant. And if the goal here, which it should be in part, is to just give these survivors accountability, clarity, justice for what happened to them, then that could be some of what gets them there. Because as I've heard these survivors come to Capitol Hill and talk about what they want to see here, a lot of it is just validation of the harm that they experienced at the hands of some of these men. And that is what I think some of these lawmakers are driving towards. I also think there's a question when it comes to what was redacted, to what was the intent of DOJ and who were they trying to protect. I had on one of the members who got to see some of those unredacted documents at DOJ yesterday, Congressman James Walkinshaw. I asked him pretty clearly, did it seem like they were doing redactions to protect, for example, the President of the United States and the number of times that his name pops up in these files? And he pretty clearly told me it does seem that way. He's not the only member, frankly, that has told me that, too. And so then it puts things squarely at the feet of the Oversight Committee as they are starting to ramp up the number of depositions that they're doing. Why are they not calling in some of these people? Yes, the president, but even below that, the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. I was asking that question of Comer yesterday. He says he doesn't want to disrupt the depositions that are already on the books. I don't know how adding to the number of depositions is going to disrupt the ones that you already have booked. But this is now a ballooning question on Capitol Hill. If the Oversight Committee is going to do the investigation, which they should in tandem with DOJ and the oversight that's being done there, then there's an open question that they are going to continue to be asked, which is, why are there some people that you're interested in talking to and others seemingly who might happen to be Republicans that you aren't?
Yeah, and I mean, John Lemire, I guess that's the question. You have Howard Lutnick, obviously. Republicans, I'm sure Republicans would love for Donald Trump to fire Howard Lutnick. Here's a guy who appears to have lied through his teeth, saying, oh, I'm so shocked. I stopped talking to him in 2005. And then he's giddily asking if he can bring his family over to Rape Island. And then you find out in the files that he's living next door to Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, so of course, that would have gotten you fired anytime, any place, anywhere, unless you're in the Trump administration, first of all. And secondly, this isn't good for Republicans. It's not good for the administration. It's not good for Donald Trump. It's not good for anybody. And then you add on top of that Republicans on the Hill and Republicans in the Justice Department are protecting the Epstein class. Why wouldn't Comer demand from Pam Bondi that she redact the names of these people that are talking about young girls, that are talking about little girls? Why does James Comer want to protect those horrible people? Why do Republicans want to protect those horrible people? Why are they so invested in protecting the Epstein class? And I'm serious when I say this next thing. I don't get it. I don't understand. Thomas Massie is the only Republican, it seems, that is out there that doesn't want to protect the Epstein class. They have made it their mission on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue to protect the Epstein class. And I will say, I don't understand what's in it for them.
Yeah, it's a question of consequences. We are seeing, for instance, in the UK, some powerful people in politics, the government there losing their posts because of ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Here in the U.S., that simply hasn't happened. Now, certainly, there are some who have suffered societal consequences. People whose reputations rightly have been ruined because of their associations with Epstein. But we haven't seen someone in Washington really take a fall yet. No one in the Trump administration. Now, some of that is because people are trying to weaponize these leaks. I mean, Elon Musk, who, mind you, does appear in these emails himself, but he's using them as a cudgel to go after Steve Bannon, who is all over them. And then there's Howard Lutnick, who I've talked to, we talked about this yesterday briefly, Joe. There was a number of Republicans who say, look, this is abhorrent what he did. Also, just in terms of political expediency, he's an easy fall guy. Like, if you feel like you need to have a sacrificial lamb, Lutnick's the guy. He's not particularly well liked in the Trump administration to begin with, though Trump himself is very fond of him. But that hasn't happened yet. There's no sign of it. And Ken Dilanian, we're obviously waiting at the end of the month for these Clinton depositions to come. And then there's this moment, which, of course, has raised scrutiny as to, well, shouldn't Donald Trump be doing that? And, of course, the Congress is saying that's not that's certainly a non-starter. But look, there's so much still we don't know. There's all these redactions. There are still so many files we'll never see. Is there any sense that more of this could eventually see the light of the day through some sort of legal process or act of Congress, even if it's perhaps, when the House changes hands?
Yes. In a word, yes, Jonathan. In fact, there's a whole group of documents that the Justice Department has decided are privileged and not subject to release, that nonetheless, I'm told by sources, are being reviewed and redacted as a contingency in case a judge orders them released. So yes, there are lots of documents, you're right, that we haven't seen that would be relevant, that maybe some litigation will spring free. On the question of are they covering up for Trump or whoever else, I just want to add a data point. Weeks ago, before this release, I was told by a source at the Justice Department that there was concern by the people redacting about a particular document that accused Donald Trump of having sex in a very graphic way with an underage girl. When these things dropped, I saw that document. You probably all have seen it. It disappeared for a while, and then it was back. And so that told me that they may be trying to cover things up, but they're not covering everything up, because that was the one thing that was flagged inside the Justice Department. There was real concern that would never see the light of day, and it did come out. So that's just a data point, guys.